today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here on this Saturday. We've got a great program coming up for you. If you are following news in the apologetic world, there has been an announcement regarding the famous Mark Fragment, perhaps now the infamous Mark Fragment. It was claimed back in 2012 that we had a first century manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. And it's been 6 years, and now Dan Wallace is able to say more about that. Well, joining me on today's program is Daniel B. Wallace. He's a senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and his reputation precedes him here on our program today. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really happy to be on it, Kurt. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thanks. First and foremost, I know that a lot of people are asking questions. They've asked me questions online here about the now perhaps infamous Mark Fragment. And so for our listeners who maybe aren't up to speed on this, could you give us some background information about what all this news is about?
Well, in February of 2012, I debated Bart Ehrman at his school, North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And in that debate, I mentioned that there was going to be published a first century fragment of Mark's Gospel. Now, I had this on good authority and was authorized, I thought, to make the announcement. But nevertheless, I was told at the time that it was definitely first century. Later, still thinking it was a first century document, I signed a non-disclosure agreement, and then I was not allowed to speak about the issue until it got published, and it just came out this week. At least the announcement of its publication. It has been published. Nobody's seen the books yet, but it's from the Egypt Exploration Society. They publish what's called the Oxyrhynchus Papyri. They've been doing this since, I think, 1898.
Okay.
And it's just amazing, the kinds of things that have been found in this one little town in Egypt. But this manuscript was just published. It is not from the first century, as I had been led to believe. It's from the second or third century.
Okay.
And the editors of this is Oxyrhynchus Papyri, volume 83. And if anybody wants to get a copy of it, they can. They probably won't find it on Amazon. Maybe they can, but it's about $150.
Yeah, right.
So it's
one of those academic journals. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an academic kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this manuscript is second or third century, which nevertheless makes it most likely the earliest fragment of Mark's Gospel that we have.
Yeah.
And it will get the official number of Papyrus 137, and that number is what's given to New Testament manuscripts. New Testament scholars have a way of categorizing these manuscripts that's different from the in-house library because they all use their own systems, and there's a universal system that we follow that was developed by a German, then an American, then a German about 100 years ago. And so this is P137.
Okay.
And the following one that was also published in this Oxyrhynchus Papyri volume in Luke's Gospel from the 3rd century is P138. And then the next one on Philemon will be called P139. It's astounding to get 3 papyri published in one volume, New Testament papyri.
Yeah, wow. Wow, that's something.
And this is certainly the oldest manuscript that is extant. That is, it exists, and we know where it is.
Yeah. Of
Mark chapter 1.
Okay, yeah. So even with regard to the section of Mark, we know that this is the earliest of that section.
Absolutely.
And you're saying here correct me if I'm wrong, it might be the earliest of Mark as well, of anything in Mark?
Yes, because the dating is late second or early third century. The only other thing that would compete with it would be P45, which was discovered in the late 20s, published in the 1930s. And this manuscript is considered to be third century, sometimes early third century, but it doesnn't have this section of Mark in it. It's got all four Gospels and Acts, although just portions. It's just 30 leaves. Quite a bit more material there than here, but this is early and very significant for that fact. This is an astounding discovery, even if it's not first century. It's pretty amazing to have this.
Yeah, we should still be celebrating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So, along with the Mark fragment, there, I believe there was a section of Luke, and there were some other parts of Scripture that were also discovered. Tell us about that.
We have Luke 13, verses 13 through 17 and 25 through 30.
Okay.
I haven't seen that manuscript yet, the images of it yet, but I'm getting my Oxyrhynchus volume in the mail here in a couple of weeks. I'll be able to see that. But this is third century, and it'll be P138 is most likely going to be the identification. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty amazing to have a third century copy of any part of Luke. P45, as I said, has 32 leaves, really is kind of how you technically count it. And that has portions of all four Gospels and Acts. But this is probably the oldest manuscript now for this passage in Luke.
Nice. That's great. So there were a lot of questions that came in to me for this interview, which is just a wonderful thing. Charles here, he asks, what the heck took so long, with a lot of question marks? I think maybe if I could put it more charitably, it was about 6 years, right, from when you were given the misinformation and to now, basically. I know for the Dead Sea Scrolls, it took something like 30 years from when they were discovered to when it was published. So for me, I haven't minded the necessary wait. But for other people, maybe explain what is this process? Why does it take years, sometimes decades, for this stuff to come out?
Right. Well, and it does. What I did not know at the time when I was told about this was that this manuscript had apparently only been recently discovered. It could have been worked on for several years prior to this, which is frequently how long it takes to look over a manuscript like this. Here's the issue. These fragments that are tiny manuscripts, this fragment is about the size of an iPhone. Something along that line.
Yeah, right.
And so you get a few lines of text on one side, a few lines on the other side. You don't have either edge of text, the left or the right side, so just text in the middle. But the scholars were able to figure out how large each page would probably be, that this was a single-column manuscript, and how many pages it would be if it were just Mark's Gospel, which is what they think, 78 pages long, or it could be part of a larger book. So, just from a single fragment, they can determine a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But they have to do all sorts of comparisons to get there. And part of it is determining the date. That takes a long, long time, and there are only just a handful of scholars in the world who are really, really competent at dating these early papyri. You have to do it by comparisons of the handwriting with other papyri, as well as the size of the manuscript, the size of the letters, how many leaves it has. There's a number of different things, and scholars have worked on this kind of thing for well over 100 years to get it down to a pretty exacting science. But when I say pretty exacting, we still can't date this fragment any better than 2nd or 3rd century. And at first, they thought it was a 1st century fragment, but I was told that it was definitely a 1st century fragment. So that was the information that people had for me. And then after I signed the non-disclosure agreement, still believing it was 1st century.
Yeah.
And having been told that, I just had to go radio silent for 6 years.
Yeah, you had to wait yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So what you're saying is
not in the loop.
Yeah, right. So what you're saying is all this time you yourself have believed that it was still possible for centuries. So it's not like 6 years ago you were corrected and told to be silent on it, right?
Well, partially.
Okay.
I was not corrected until after I signed the non-disclosure agreement. And at that time, I don't remember, it was probably a couple of years after it, I was told that it is probably first century, not certainly first century.
Yeah.
And so it changed things a little bit, but still I thought, well, why was I told it was definitely first century?
Right.
And that's what I announced in my debate with Bart Ehrman, but I'm not going to name names. I don't think that's appropriate, and others can deal with that issue.
Sure, and I certainly don't want to out the person that fed you the misinformation. I am curious, though, that...
The person or persons.
Person or persons, sure, yeah. So in your blog post here, where you explain the background, and we'll put up a link to this at our site, you write, I was also told that a high-ranking papyrologist, am I saying that correctly?
Papyrologist.
Papyrologist. Had confirmed that FCM was definitely a first-century manuscript. So, again, I don't want to out the person that or persons that gave you the misinformation, since I have no clue. But are you able to tell us the name of that high-ranking papyrologist? I have trouble with that word.
Yeah, I'm.
Or you just prefer not to?
I prefer not to.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's some issues that are unresolved about this, and I don't want to add fuel to the fire. Let others deal with the problems, and I'm not in the business of trying to condemn somebody else explicitly.
Sure.
You know, I mean, I had to tell my story, but I was not allowed to tell my story until 2 days ago. So and I believed something without personal verification 6 years ago. And since that time, I've once bitten, twice. Or what is it? Once anyway. I've learned the lesson. I can't remember the little idiom we've got. But.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the questioners here, Justin, he asks, "What lessons have you learned through this process?"
Well, I've learned that I need to personally verify these things. If I hear a particular date from a papyrologist, I need to ask if I can mention names, and I want to make sure I get that directly from that papyrologist or paleographer, that scholar, because to not mention names, I was eager to share this information at the debate that I had with Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
Because
as would anyone. I mean,
what's that?
As would anyone. Anyone would really be wanting to share this information.
Sure. Well, in our second debate at Southern Methodist University just a few months earlier, he said the earliest manuscript we have of Mark's Gospel is 3rd century. How can we possibly tell what this text originally said? It could have been completely different. And during the Q&A period, there was a fellow who asked, he was actually a good friend of mine, who asked Bart, what would it take for you to believe that we have good copies of Mark's Gospel? And I don't know exactly, I can't remember the exact wording, I've got it written down someplace, but he said something to the effect of, we'd have to have 10 scribes writing within 2 weeks of the completion of Mark's Gospel, and they make 0.01% errors between them, and that was it. And I thought, now again, that's not an exact quote, so you can look at the DVD. It's we have the DVD of the debate for sale at csntm.org.
Okay.
It was a professionally done debate, 2 hours. Photography team that came and videoed it.
Yeah.
But and that was the largest debate ever over the text of the New Testament. But when he said that, that's what it would take for him to be convinced we have accurate copies of Mark. Well, he was setting the bar so high that absolutely nothing before the printing press can match that. And except for the original documents we have of something. Even Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, we got, 5 copies of it, and they all have some disagreements with each other. So this kind of requirement, I thought, was insane. And I worked out the numbers, and it ended up being something to the effect of about 1/2 letter difference between these 10 copies. Well, that's, you're not even going to get that with the printing press. You're going to have some ink not show up. So So I thought this was crazy, but he said, there's no way we can tell what Mark originally said, and he kept speaking about how we don't have any sense of it. So when I heard about this Mark fragment and that it was first century, I thought, well, this is a good time to mention this in relation to what he had been saying about us not having anything earlier than the 3rd century. So I mentioned it in the debate, and he said something like, who is this papyrologist, Donald Duck? And so he completely dismissed it, which is not appropriate on his part, but the lesson I learned was, no, I should mention names right then, and I can tell you who published this thing. It's in the Oxyrhynchus volume that just came out. This is Dirk Abink and is it Daniela Colomo, I think? I don't know the second person, but Colomo was the last name. But they are the ones who published it.
Okay.
By the way, just to go back to that in terms of how long it takes to get these published, a fragment of this size and this importance is something that a whole doctoral dissertation could be based on.
Yeah.
And so somebody could spend 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 hours on this for the publication. And they have to do what's called comparanda, where they're comparing this manuscript to other manuscripts, the kind of font it uses, the dates of these manuscripts. Some of them are dated, some are not, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And there's thousands of these papyri that are out there, and we need to do the rigorous comparisons to come to the appropriate date, and even just to figure out what the letters say. Is not altogether easy. One of the things I've learned in working with papyri, and I've worked in them extensively since this time, starting in 2013, the very next year, is that the more you know a scribe's hand, the more you can anticipate what a few dots of ink mean when it's 3 or 4 pages later, because that shape can only mean this letter or these 2 or 3 letters. And you have to get used to every single scribe's hand to be able to determine that. You can't just come in at blind and transcribe a single page of a papyrus. You're working through the whole text. And CSNTM has worked, we spent over 10,000 hours, I believe, on the transcriptions of 3 early papyri that we will be publishing. I'm not at liberty to say what those 3 early papyri are, but we will be publishing them, we believe, next year sometime.
Yeah. Okay, nice.
And they're extensive papyri. They're not just little fragments.
Oh, that's great.
So there's been something like 5 or 6 people that have worked on each one of them.
Yeah.
So it's a long time. The point is it takes a long time, and 1,000, 2,000 hours or so to do all the serious labor that is needed on one of these fragments to get it published and make sure you're accurate. So I didn't know that the definite date of 1st century was actually a preliminary guess. It was presented to me as this is definite. So anyway, that's in the past. I wouldn't worry about that. Let's just move on with what we've got, which is, if that had never come up, the publication of this manuscript, it's P. Oxy or Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5345 is the number, would make huge headlines. The earliest fragment of Mark's Gospel, or at least certainly the earliest fragment of Mark chapter 1.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Right. It's still a great
It
discovery.
is, absolutely.
Yeah, so we should definitely be still playing up the release here of these.
Right.
There have been a couple people, so I'll just make this sort of my last question. There were multiple questions about non-disclosure agreements. Some people are wondering, did you have to sign it? What was in it for you to sign a non-disclosure agreement? What can you say even now? Are there some things that you still can't say? So we had multiple questions on that front.
I understand. Because there's other things involved in that non-disclosure agreement still that I have not at all made public. It's best for me not to comment on what I signed, nor why I felt obligated to. I could have said no.
Yeah.
But if that were the case, then other parts of this agreement of just some things I know about that I can't talk about now at all.
Yeah.
I would not have been able to know about. So.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, that's all. We'll sort of leave that in the past now, I think. I'm sure there are folks with still lots of questions, but maybe over time. If things can't come out, they will. But nevertheless, as you said, we should still be celebrating over the discoveries here of these early fragments. That's great. Well, here's what we'll do. So we'll take a short break now for our program. And when we come back, I want to ask you more about the work that you're doing, digitizing manuscripts and all that with the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. So stick with us.
Hey, you got that name right. That's rare.
Yeah, thanks. All right, stick with us through the short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. Today I am joined by none other than Dan Wallace. He's the Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary and just a prolific scholar in the area of textual criticism, a true brainiac. And Dan, before we continue, I heard one story, and maybe you could tell me about this. I heard once that you got into an accident of some sort and you lost your memory. And it's something like you had to reteach yourself how to read Greek. Is that accurate? Is that
part of it? Is I did not get in an accident. What I did was I got encephalitis, and that was 21 years ago. It was a very serious kind that the CDC never could identify. It was unique for me. I said, "Well, if you ever identify it, name it after me." You know? I ended up in 5 hospitals. Mayo Clinic essentially saved my life.
Wow.
And I was in a wheelchair for a year. It happened in March of '97, and during that following summer, I was sleeping 22 hours a day.
Whoa!
So I'd get up and I could read maybe 10 minutes before I'd just flat out fall asleep.
Wow.
So for a solid year, I was virtually worthless. I was still teaching a full load at Dallas Seminary, but I couldn't drive. So a student would pick me up in his truck, we'd put the wheelchair in the back, and then we'd go to school. It was very kind of him to do that. I did not forget all of my Greek, but I forgot such a substantial portion that my estimate was that I was about at the level of somebody who had just completed 1 year in New Testament Greek.
Which to go from a scholar, an expert, to that is, wow.
Yeah, and so I had published a second year, it's second and third year, it's a syntax book, which is advanced Greek, that second-year students and later students use to study the New Testament. I published it a year earlier. It took me 17 years to write that book, and it's about 850 pages long.
Yeah.
So it was really my magnum opus at the time, and when I lost my memory of Greek, I started to read it, and I didn't remember
what
writing
you had written.
Actually most of it.
Wow. So
there were times I'd read this and I'd say, "What is this guy trying to say?" And I go, "Oh, well, that's me." And there'd be other times I'd say, "Hey, that was a good statement." "Oh, that's bragging, it's me." But I mean, it was a blank.
Yeah, wow.
And I'm teaching that stuff at Dallas Seminary, trying to keep ahead of the students by reading it. But it was Lee Strobel who pointed this out when he interviewed me, 2006 or 7, for his book, The Case for the Real Jesus. And when he interviewed me, talked about the encephalitis, and I think the opening paragraph in that, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, He said, here's a guy who taught himself Greek using the textbook that he wrote. And I had never put it together that way, but that's right.
Yeah.
So it took me a long time to recover, and there's still things I haven't recovered 21 years later. I mean, I lost, it was strange. I lost my other languages, not entirely, but to a large degree. So I could read Hebrew, but I didn't know what a lamed was. And I could even read some sections of unpointed Hebrew where you don't have the vowel points, and it's just the consonants, and that's pretty highbrow Hebrew. I kind of double majored in seminary where I got enough credits to get a major in Old Testament Hebrew and a double major in New Testament Greek as well. So I was pretty proficient at Hebrew, and I could read unpointed text where you actually put in the vowels. It's like if you take out all the vowels and just have consonants in English, what is it going to say?
Right.
And that's how Hebrew is actually written.
Yeah.
But then here I come to lamed, which is one of the letters, and I didn't recognize it.
Wow.
So it was just kind of hit or miss what was taken. I didn't know my wife's name at one point. And I had just so many different neurological evidences that were just absolutely bizarre. I mean, not only could I not walk, but I'd get hot and cold inexplicably. My parents drove across the country from Seattle to Rochester, Minnesota to meet me for the Mayo Clinic visit. I flew in, they picked me up at the airport. And here it was October, but it was snowing in October. And I was wearing a short-sleeve shirt and sweating.
Wow. And I take it that the shirt you were wearing was a Hawaiian shirt, I'm sure.
I think probably not back then, but
Okay.
I finally decided I'm going to be a rebel and say, hey, look, the surf sucks in Dallas, and I want to go back to Newport Beach where I grew up. So.
Yeah, for those that have seen pictures of you online, more recent pictures, you're just wearing Hawaiian shirts all the time now, it seems.
That's it, yeah.
Nice. Great. All right, why don't we, we've got a segment of the show that we call Rapid Questions here. And it's just 60 seconds where we ask you goofy questions about your life. And so if you're ready, we'll start the game show clock. I don't think you'll be able to hear it, but I'll let you know when the time is up. So,
okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Clothing store?
Yeah.
I have none. I don't shop for clothes. Obviously, I get Hawaiian shirts.
Taco Bell or KFC?
I love KFC, but it doesn't love me, so I'd have to go with Taco Bell.
What song is playing on your radio these days?
Well, I don't know. I listen to old-time classic rock.
Nice. Where would you like to live?
I'd love to live in Newport Beach again, but I can't afford it.
What's your most hated sports franchise?
Oh, that's a great question. It's got to be a football team because I'm a real football
How about
fan.
the Patriots? Most hated.
They're not in the NFC, so maybe the Redskins or Eagles or something like that. Anybody who plays against Dallas.
I'll ask you one last question here. Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
That's a Darrell Bach thing. He lives on Dr. Pepper. He's a colleague of mine at Dallas Seminary.
What have I been doing for 2 years on this program?
I gotta probably have a gallon a day.
He has what? Does he drink like a 2 liter a day?
Yes. Yeah, he does. I should buy stock just because of that.
Wow. Okay, so you said Newport Beach was kind of that was home for you. Is that right?
That's where I grew up. I was a body surfer growing up and playing football, and I just loved it.
Yeah.
I'm not about to get back into the ocean again at 66 degrees. I never had a wetsuit, but I can't do that nowadays. But still, I'd like to watch the waves.
Yeah, that's great. And so how long, I see here you did your undergrad at the very place I went to school, Biola University.
Good.
So, but we likely went, some 30 years apart.
Well, when I went to Biola back in the 70s, it was an okay school. It wasn't a great school. But there were some really terrific professors, and I latched on to a guy by the name of Harry Sturz who taught me most of my Greek. He was just terrific. And you can always find excellent professors even at mediocre schools. But today I'd say Biola is absolutely one of the best Christian schools out there. They've really done a magnificent job. So you got a superb education.
Yeah. That's good to know. Good to know I turned out okay, hopefully.
Well, I don't know if you turned out okay.
Well, right, yeah. That's great. All right, so now with the rest of the time here that we've got today, I want to pick your brain about the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts.
Okay.
And the work that you're doing there, the very important work that you're doing there. And I'm not even sure some people realize how important this work is. So tell us about what you're doing there.
The Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, or CSNTM, is a nonprofit institute that I founded in 2002. And our primary objective, or our initial objective, is to take digital photographs of existing Greek New Testament manuscripts throughout the world. Now, our goal actually was to get all of them digitized. We knew that we would not get the permission to get all of them digitized, but at least our work, which I believe was the first time anybody started really digitizing Greek New Testament manuscripts, has stimulated many libraries, especially these large ones that have deep pockets, to digitize their own. So the Vatican is digitizing their own, the British Library and places like that have digitized their manuscripts. But we have gone to over 40 sites throughout the world and are the world's leading institute in digitizing New Testament manuscripts. We have about 500,000 pages digitized, and we use state-of-the-art equipment. Our cameras now are 50 megapixels, and each photograph in TIFF, which is the highest resolution, is 300 megabytes for one picture. So it's state-of-the-art equipment, and we go on expeditions always during the summer and frequently during the school year, and I can't tell ahead of time where we're going to be because of how expensive the equipment is that we're bringing. We don't want it to get stolen when we land at an airport, you know.
Yeah, right.
So it's really magnificent, but I'll be leaving soon for an Eastern European country, and then other countries in Europe this summer. I get to go and prepare the manuscripts for digitization, and we have a team that comes later to digitize. What I get to do is examine these manuscripts and write up the metadata on each one, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
I've looked at just as many manuscripts as perhaps anybody ever, Greek New Testament manuscripts, in terms of looking at them in detail. And it's fun to write a 2 or 3 page document on each one and give a table of contents, what the probable date is, the approximate date, how many leaves there are, what the material is, whether it's papyrus or parchment or paper, how
all
many
those
lines per page,
tidbits
dimensions,
of information,
just tons of stuff.
Yeah.
What's that?
All the little tidbits, like you said, the metadata, all the information about it. Yeah, that's
and
great.
other fun things. I notice icons in what's called excessus, which are enlarged letters that go out into the margin because it tells the reader that what I'm about to say is important. This is an important paragraph coming up. Fascinating things that these manuscripts and these scribes did so that the reader could have a good sense of what they're reading and the importance of it.
Yeah, and now for those who might be wondering, well, why should we digitize? I mean, for starters, it makes the manuscripts more easily accessible. You know, someone like myself could look online. You know, I don't have to go to a museum to find this. I don't have to go to a library that's holding it in its archives. I can just...
Well, not only that, but if you're not an expert in this area, you can't look at the manuscripts unless they're on display, and you get to look at the open pages, and that's it.
Yeah, right. So there's accessibility. But also, for me, I think one of the biggest reasons to do this is preservation.
Absolutely.
That the manuscripts deteriorate over time, and by digitizing them, we can continue their legacy of existence in digital format.
Yeah, I should hire you. You're saying exactly what the case is.
And so I think also too here in the Middle East, you know, when there's unrest, civil unrest, it threatens not just manuscripts but other ancient artifacts as well. Like ISIS has been blowing up towns
Absolutely.
and things like that. And if all of a sudden they blow up and destroy, you know, some manuscripts, well, hopefully we already digitized those, you know, that we don't lose them.
They are, just last year they attacked a monastery for the first time. It was St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai in Egypt. The oldest continuously inhabited monastery in the world goes back to about 550 AD, 550. I think they killed one policeman, and I don't recall. It was a minor attack, I think it was a test to see if the monastery could hold them off. That has the second largest collection of Greek manuscripts in the world, just after the Vatican. So if those got destroyed, that would be unspeakable loss.
And you're saying we don't know if that happened? If they did in fact?
No, they did not do that. They were not successful.
Oh, okay.
But it's the first time they actually attacked a monastery. They didn't get in and hurt any manuscripts. But I know that there's people working there to digitize the manuscripts they have. I've been there before for a week examining some manuscripts and discovered two others in their collection that they didn't know they had. I mean, they've got so much. It would just take a dozen scholars 10 years to go through to really see everything they've got real carefully. Amazing collection.
Wow. So in your work for CSNTM, what's been the earliest manuscript that you've handled?
First century AD manuscript from the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek translation.
Okay, nice.
And we've also handled manuscripts that are as early possibly as the 2nd century. P46, which is the oldest manuscript we have of Paul's letters, and it's 86 leaves of an original 104 leaves, and it's our oldest manuscript of Paul. It's just amazing. It has most of Paul's letters in it still, and most of those leaves are very close to being complete, like 80 to 90% complete, so the text is intact largely. That manuscript has been dated right around AD 200, maybe 25 years earlier, maybe 25 years later.
Yeah.
So we've got manuscripts like that we've handled and photographed.
Nice.
Those things are absolutely precious. The way to preserve papyri is to put them individually as leaves between two plates of glass and then seal it. And then don't break the glass.
Right. Yeah, so for those that go to the, I believe it's the library at Manchester, you can see P52. The oldest manuscript that we still have. That's a small fragment of John 18, and it's the John Rylands Library at Manchester University in England. Okay,
it's typically it has been dated 100 to 150. Some are wanting to push it a little bit later now, but still, I think most scholars would say no, 100 to 150 is the right range.
Yeah, and so you mentioned how it's sort of like pressed up against glass on both sides. This is the case, especially with P52. You can go and you see it's just in glass.
Right.
So now here's
that really is a good way to preserve them because it's oxygen that deteriorates these manuscripts and humidity. But certain manuscripts, like parchment manuscripts, need to be in a somewhat humid environment. And you can't start slicing out leaves of these manuscripts and put those between plates of glass. You do that with papyrus.
Yeah.
But parchment or animal skin, vellum manuscripts, they just try to preserve them as well as they can in a temperature and humidity controlled room.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because you can't, and you don't want to cut them up.
Right, exactly.
You'd be destroying the book.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you. I know you guys take your own pictures. Are you able to, on your website, do you have pictures of the work of others that are digitizing, or is it only sort of the things you have rights to take pictures of?
We have links to scores of other sites.
Yeah.
So, for example, all of the papyri except just the latest ones that I just talked about, we either have images on our site or links to other sites that have them, except for one papyrus, which is in Russia, and there are no photographs of it. We're hoping to go there someday to photograph it.
Yeah,
There's
someday.
only one.
Yeah. Wow, that is something. And
we've got I think 1,200 manuscripts that are on our website, which includes I think maybe a third of those are manuscripts we have not photographed. Others have. Or we've got the microfilms that were converted to digital images by permission.
Yeah.
Things like that. But you got, well over 500,000 pages that we've got that we've done ourselves on the website that anybody can see for free, and it's free for all time.
Yep. As long as no one hacks the website.
Well, if they did, they'd have to go through 6 layers of
security and
prevention. Yeah, security is very secure.
That's right. That's great. And
it's higher standards than even, I think, some of the world's best libraries.
Yeah. And so, remind me, how long have you been doing that? Digitizing
Since 2002.
Okay. Very nice. That's
the very
great.
first place we went to was St. Catherine's Monastery.
Yeah. That's great. All right, so we've got a couple questions here from some of our followers that I want to ask you, and some of them, one fellow is quite technical. I think he's very knowledgeable in this field. This question is a little over my head, but before I ask you that question, here we have Carrie who asks, how do you think CBGM is going to change the textual criticism game? So, Dan, please enlighten me. What is CBGM?
Well, you've got some rather well-read audience here. CBGM stands for Coherence-Based Genealogical Method.
Okay.
And it's a method that was developed in Münster, Germany, at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, or INTF are the initials for the German name. They have worked on that for a couple of decades at least. And I think even longer. But what it is it uses computer software with the database of the manuscripts that they are keying into computers to show the relationship of these manuscripts in terms of the wording that they have. And ultimately, what they are hoping to do, they've just published volumes on the Catholic epistles, or the general letters, the 7 that Paul did not write, and not including Hebrews either. But those, they've got this database now, and they've used CBGM to work through the data to see what the genealogical relationships of these readings are, the wording in these manuscripts, and they've come up with genealogical trees that are just absolutely fascinating. I'd say that it is a game changer to some extent. It does not replace the older tools that we used of examining the actual manuscripts, comparing them to others, the groupings of the manuscripts we've had, and especially thinking about the internal evidence. What would the scribe be likely to do? What the author would be likely to have written. It doesn't replace that. It's a layer on top of that we also use to determine the wording of the original. So in their Catholic letters, what they did was they changed 34 places where the previous edition of the Greek New Testament that was published in Münster, Germany, I mean the one that these critical scholars have worked on, they now disagree with that in 34 places. Now the great majority of them don't affect very much at all. But there are some that are very significant readings. For example, Jude 5, they now believe that the original wording says that instead of the Lord was the one who delivered his people out of Egypt, Jesus is the one who delivered his people out of Egypt.
So
that's a remarkable reading.
So what you're saying here is, after discovering other manuscripts over time, scholars have come to the general position that the original writing said something different than, say, what most of our English translations say. And in this case, you have an example where the word is Jesus and not just Lord, that Jesus delivered them out of Egypt.
There's nothing that says Peter did it or the angel of the Lord or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's now identifying what we mean by Lord. And this is a reading that I thought was authentic when I worked on the Net Bible, which came out, I think, in about 2005. The New English translations, you can find it online, Bible.org or netbible.org. But it's the first Bible to have extensive footnotes. It's got about 60,000 footnotes in it, including quite a few that are on textual problems. And at Jude 5, I was the textual critic and the senior New Testament editor for it. At Jude 5, I felt Jesus was the original wording. And so I got one right, I think. But there's some other places that the new Nestle All in 28th edition that uses the CBGM for the Catholic epistles, that they've changed what they think is the original, and I've got to wrestle through some of those to see if I think they're right.
Yeah, wow. So this sounds like it's a related question. It comes from James, and he gave me a couple technical questions. I said, you got to dumb it down for even me to understand. So here's what he asks. He says, it is widely accepted that interpreters of the New Testament should not put a lot of weight, if any, on parts of the text that have shaky textual foundations. This is a view he's asking. You have proposed that there are cases such as Mark 1:41 and the last 12 verses of Mark where the testimony of one or two Greek manuscripts can outweigh all the other Greek manuscripts, even when very early patristic writers support the usual reading. If that approach is consistently applied, then as more and more manuscripts are discovered, containing more and more variants, is there not a danger that such an approach would ultimately make the text less stable and thus nullify more of it as far as its usefulness and interpretation is concerned, rather than making it more stable? I know that's a complex question from James.
Yeah, I know who James is too.
Okay, so maybe because he just seems quite knowledgeable here.
He does. Yeah, he's a very bright guy. I would say that he's truncating quite a bit of the evidence that we're actually looking at. Okay. It's not just Greek manuscripts, and it's not just church fathers. It's also ancient versions in Latin and Syriac and Coptic. And there's an early work known as the Diatessaron, which was done by a man named Tatian in the second half of the 2nd century, where he combined all 4 Gospels and put them together. It's also internal evidence that he hasn't mentioned at all. What is the author likely to have written, and what are the scribes likely to have done? So let me take the example of Mark 1:41 that he mentioned to start with. Mark 1:41 has a single Greek manuscript that has the word Jesus was angry, or being angry, he told the the leper that he would heal him. And this leper comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, if you're willing, you can heal me. And all the rest of the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, say, having compassion, Jesus said, I am willing, and then he healed him. The difference between having compassion and being angry in the Greek is orgistheis and splanknistheis. The istheis ending is the same. So the question here is, did a scribe make a mistake to put being angry in there? If he did, how in the world could he make that kind of a mistake, adding something that doesn't sound, what scribe would do this knowingly? And the scribe who actually has it in his text wrote out thought lines where he was actually a thinking scribe. He would not have done that accidentally. There's other scribes who could have, but not this particular scribe. It goes back to an earlier tradition. It's what we think we have in the Diatessaron, and there's some Latin witnesses that have it as well. And then when you compare this passage to Matthew and Luke, neither one of them mentions that Jesus was compassionate. They don't mention that he was angry. But in the other places where Mark speaks of Jesus' anger, they typically say nothing. So what Matthew and Luke, most scholars would say, used Mark's gospel to make their own. And they used it extensively. And where they saw that Mark was making kind of a rough-hewn picture of Jesus, they didn't deny that. They simply did not affirm it. And so they're not telling us something that's an error about Jesus. They're just not telling the whole story. Of course, Mark isn't either. So you've got those kinds of things. And Bart Ehrman actually wrote a marvelous article on this for Gerald Hawthorne in his Festschrift, which is means a writing celebrating a scholar who has had a huge influence. It's a German name. But in Gerald Hawthorne's Festschrift, Bart Ehrman wrote a chapter called "A Leper in the Hands of an Angry Jesus," after
sinner's hands in the of an angry
God. There you go.
Yeah.
Sorry, brain dead today. So, but sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? Yeah. So, I thought it was a really nice piece. But when James is asking this question, he's not asking about all the evidence. He's asking about the manuscripts alone, Greek manuscripts, almost as if that's the only thing that counts. And then let's look at Mark 16, for example. Mark 16, 9 through 20, it is true, we have only 2 Greek manuscripts that don't have those verses. But they happen to be our oldest manuscripts and the ones that most scholars would say are the most reliable or just about the most reliable manuscripts we have. So they're not unimportant. And when he mentions church fathers, we have at the beginning of the 4th century and the end of the 4th century, Eusebius and Jerome, who were both doing productions of the New Testament. Jerome in Latin, Eusebius in Greek. And as they were doing the productions, Eusebius had the wealth of the Roman Empire behind him, but Constantine had commissioned him to make 50 Bibles for Constantinople, and he had a workshop where scribes were copying these out. And he had Origen's library from the 3rd century in Caesarea Maritima. So he had access to a great deal of manuscripts. And what he says at the beginning of the 4th century is there's hardly any manuscripts that have this long ending. Hardly any. And at the end of the 4th century, Jerome says there's hardly any Greek manuscripts, which suggests that he's saying something a little bit different from Eusebius, and it may even hint that possibly the long ending started to have an infiltration into the Latin manuscripts more than the Greek. But there's other ancient versions that don't have the long ending in the early. It's almost always the earliest manuscripts of those versions that have something different from what we see in our New Testaments today.
Yeah.
So, it's disingenuous to just talk about the Greek manuscripts. There's just a whole lot more evidence. And then when you look at the internal evidence from Mark 16, it just doesn't look like Mark's gospel at all. The syntax, the style, the theological viewpoint, the wording, everything looks like it's written by a later hand. And I had one of my doctoral students wrote his dissertation on the internal evidence. In other words, the style, syntax, vocabulary, all this kind of stuff of Mark 16, 9 through 20. He went through word by word, phrase by phrase, concept by concept. And he said he found things that said, well, this could be Markan, this is probably not. But overwhelmingly, he came to the decision and produced quite a bit of data. This just doesn't look like Mark.
Yeah.
So it becomes the single most anomalous passage in all of Mark's gospel that looks aberrant, looks different from the rest of Mark. And it has early witnesses, both Greek, virginal, and patristic, that say it's not Mark. So tell me why we should keep it in the Greek text. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, wow. Well, there's certainly a lot more to be explored in the area of textual criticism. And unfortunately, time permits us from exploring all of those things. But really, it's just a great blessing that the Christian community has had to have someone like yourself devote essentially your life's work to this area. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the show and your invitation, Kurt. I appreciate it very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. Have a great one.
All right. Bye-bye.
Well, that does it for our show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a couple bucks each month to help us go. And also, I'm grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. I want to thank our technical producer today, Rob, and for our guest, Dan Wallace, for coming on today's program and giving us that update on the Mark Fragment. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.